Welcome to the Sleep Science channel. You're letting go. Maybe not for the first time, maybe not all at once, but the decision has been made. Something in you has already stepped back, already accepted what's been lost, what won't return, or what cannot stay the same. And yet there's something else that hasn't followed, a part of you that lingers quietly even as everything else begins to move forward. You've stopped reaching out. You're not trying to fix it anymore. You've told yourself the story is over, or that it's no longer yours to carry. But something still holds on, not loudly, not painfully, just enough to make it hard to feel free. You've let go, at least on the surface, but something inside hasn't. This kind of quiet resistance doesn't always come from love or longing. It can come from patterns, from memory, from the way something shaped your identity while it lasted. A relationship, a place, a version of yourself that existed alongside someone else. And even when you no longer want it back, even when you've accepted the end, the imprint remains. That's what we'll explore now. The space between letting go and truly being free. What keeps us lightly tethered to what's already behind us, and why some parts take longer to release. There are moments in life when the decision has already been made. You've stepped back, you've said the words or simply stopped saying them, you've stopped checking, stopped hoping, stopped waiting for something to come back around. On the surface, everything seems resolved. But somewhere, just under that surface, there's a trace of something that didn't leave with the rest. A subtle echo. A shape in the air where something used to be. You've let go, but something hasn't. It happens often after a relationship ends. Not the kind that ends in one sudden moment, but the kind that fades. The kind that slowly thins out until it's only barely there. And then eventually not at all. You move on. You accept that it wasn't right, that it couldn't continue. Maybe you even feel relief. And yet, in quiet moments, you notice that your mind still reaches for them. A song, a place, a phrase they used to say. It comes without pain, and yet it pulls. Not enough to bring you back, but enough to remind you that something in you was shaped around their presence. And reshaping takes time. You are not holding on anymore, but a piece of you hasn't yet recalibrated. That's not weakness. It's just part of how connection leaves its trace. The deeper the imprint, the slower the release. Sometimes it isn't love, but friendship that lingers, a bond that slowly faded without conflict. You didn't grow apart in a dramatic way. You just stopped reaching for each other. Schedules changed. Priorities shifted. Texts went unanswered and then unsent. And at some point, you realized you no longer knew how their days looked. But every now and then, something reminds you. You see something they would have loved. You go somewhere they once talked about visiting. And for a moment, you feel their absence like a shadow. It's not painful, not even sad, really. It just feels unfinished. Like a door was never fully closed, only left slightly ajar. You don't want to return to how it was, but you also never said goodbye. And that lack of closure creates a small holding pattern, as if your mind is still waiting for one more message, one more walk, one more shared moment that will never come. Family can leave its own kind of residue, not always because of conflict, but because of distance, physical or emotional. You set boundaries, you step away. Maybe you've accepted that connection won't look the way you once hoped, and yet part of you still monitors their world from afar, still reacts when their name appears, still imagines a different version of events that might have unfolded if only things had been safer or softer. You've let go of the expectation. You've stopped trying to repair what isn't yours to fix, but something in you hasn't entirely stopped caring. There's a loyalty that outlives reason. And even if you never return, even if no words are exchanged again, your system still tenses slightly at the memory of their voice. Not out of love, necessarily, but out of imprint. There are people who disappear without warning, who were once in your life fully, vividly, consistently, and then suddenly they aren't. Not through death, not through breakup, just absence, a drifting, a silence that wasn't explained. And when there's no clear ending, the mind doesn't always file it away as complete. You might tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you've moved on, that it wasn't that deep. But the nervous system stores incompletion in quiet ways. You see someone who looks like them in a crowd. You hear a voice that matches theirs in a passing conversation, and something in you lights up, just for a moment. Then it fades again. The rest of you stays grounded. But that flicker means something. It means you haven't entirely let go of the idea that they might return, that a conversation might one day resume, even if you don't want it to, even if you've rebuilt without them. There are feelings that come from almost, from stories that never fully started. The person you were drawn to, but never quite reached. The conversation that hinted at something more, but never bloomed. You moved on, you forgot mostly. But sometimes the memory returns, not with longing, but with curiosity. What might have been? Who you might have been? Had something gone differently? These are not regrets, just small, unfinished thoughts. Thoughts that don't hurt, but don't quite go away either. You're not holding on to them. But your mind hasn't quite filed them under ended. They live in a separate space, not current, not unresolved, just paused forever. Letting go can be complicated when there were words left unsaid. Not dramatic speeches, not final confrontations. Just the small, honest sentences that never found their way out. I wasn't ready. That hurt more than I let on. I cared more than I showed. These words gather in quiet places. You might not even notice them anymore. But sometimes, when you're doing something completely unrelated, they rise, mid-sentence, mid-breath. Not to be spoken, but simply to be remembered. Because when an ending arrives too quickly or too quietly, part of the mind stays behind, rehearsing lines for an audience that's no longer there. Not out of hope, not out of obsession, just because it doesn't know what else to do with them. You can also get caught between versions of yourself. The person you were in a particular chapter, the one who responded a certain way, who tolerated things you no longer would, who saw the world through a softer or more hopeful lens. That version of you is gone, but parts of them remain. You feel it when you return to old places or when you hear your own voice say something familiar in a way that surprises you. You've grown, you've changed, but not everything updates at the same time. Some pieces trail behind, catching up slowly, still wired to old expectations or reactions that no longer serve you. You've let go of who you were, but something in you remembers. And that remembering can sometimes sound like resistance. Then there are the dreams you've outgrown, the goals you once chased with everything you had. You might not miss them now. You might not even want them anymore. But a trace of them still lives in the way you measure your days, in the way you compare your current path to the one you once thought you'd be on. is not that you're stuck. It's not that you haven't accepted change. But the mind takes time to reorient, and for a while, it may still check the old map, even when you've chosen a different road. That map isn't useful now. But part of you still remembers where it once led, and forgetting takes longer than we expect. You might also notice that even when something is over, your body doesn't always believe it. Your nervous system can stay activated long after the threat is gone. A raised heart rate when you think of a name, a tightening in the chest when you pass a familiar place. You've told yourself it's finished. You've said the words, but your system was trained to respond, and those responses don't switch off on command. Letting go in that sense isn't just emotional, it's biological. It takes repetition, safety, time. You are not weak for still reacting. You are just human, and systems wired for survival take their time. Sometimes what you're letting go of isn't a person or a place. It's a pattern, a role you always played, the one who gives, the one who listens, the one who stays calm when everyone else is unraveling. When you begin to release that role, it can feel like something's missing. Not because you want the responsibility back, but because you don't know who you are without it yet. That identity held you together once, and even if it no longer fits, the space it leaves behind can feel uncertain. You've stepped away from the role, but your instincts haven't caught up yet. You still reach for the old tools, still scan the room for what needs fixing, even when you know it's not yours anymore. There's also a kind of inner loyalty that makes letting go feel like betrayal. You tell yourself you should move on, that it's better this way, that you deserve peace. And yet, the act of releasing still feels like turning your back, as if holding on is the only way to honor what was real. This isn't logical, and it doesn't need to be. Sometimes, the emotional rules we follow don't make sense, but they feel true. You're not holding on because you want to suffer. You're holding on because a part of you equates letting go with erasing. And that part doesn't want to forget. Not out of longing, but out of respect. You can know it's time to move forward and still feel conflicted about what that means. You may also notice that your mind searches for understanding before it agrees to let something go, as if resolution requires clarity, as if peace is something you can earn by figuring it all out. But not every story ends with answers. Not every question gets a satisfying response, and not every goodbye comes with explanation. Your logic knows this, but another part of you is still turning over the same pieces, trying to find the missing line. The one that will make it all make sense. The one that will finally allow your thoughts to stop circling. You're not obsessed, you're unfinished. And that's something different. Letting go can even challenge your sense of identity. You were someone to someone, you played a role in their life, and when that story ends, you're not just adjusting to their absence, you're adjusting to the loss of who you were with them. That role had shape, structure, familiarity, and even if it wasn't healthy, even if it wasn't aligned, it still gave your days a certain rhythm. When that rhythm disappears, the silence can feel disorienting. Not because you want the past back, but because you don't yet know what the future sounds like without it. Each of these moments holds the same quiet truth. Letting go is not one decision. It's a process. And even when you've made the choice, something in you may need more time. Some people describe it as an echo, others as a kind of quiet tension that they can't quite name. A sense that something inside them didn't get the memo, that a part of their emotional system is still acting as if they're in the middle of something that has long since ended. You could be moving through your day, making new choices, even forming new connections. And still, there's a slight undercurrent that hasn't shifted. You're not stuck in the past. You're not resisting change. You're simply carrying residue from what once mattered. And that residue doesn't dissolve on a schedule. It's not uncommon to experience these inner delays. Even when your life looks entirely different, your body and mind may still be waiting for something that no longer exists. This happens often when we've been in the habit of care, of protecting someone, worrying about them, checking in. You may have consciously released the person, the dynamic, even the responsibility. But that internal rhythm of concern can linger, like a muscle that tightens reflexively, even after the threat is gone. And then you notice it in quiet moments, how you still scan for updates, how you still anticipate their reactions, even though they no longer have access to your world. It's not about them anymore. It's about the imprint they left on the structure of your thoughts. There are also moments where your grief doesn't match your logic. You may not miss the person. You may not even want what you had. But the space they occupied still echoes with their absence. You might catch yourself reaching for the phone, thinking about telling them something, and then remembering that they're not in your life anymore. It doesn't bring sadness exactly, it just interrupts you. The body still responds to patterns, and patterns take longer to fade than feelings do. Even when the emotional weight has lifted, the rhythm of habit takes time to settle. For some, this shows up as a kind of emotional lag. You've made peace with what happened. You understand it, you talked it through. But the feelings haven't fully caught up. You still flinch when certain topics come up. You still pause before entering certain places. It's as if part of your inner world is operating on a different clock. You can't force it to hurry. And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means that healing and detachment don't always move in sync. The choice to let go can be immediate, but the experience of being free unfolds slowly. Sometimes the thing you're letting go of is an imagined future, a version of your life that you thought was forming, a story you told yourself, not because you were naive, but because it made sense at the time. And when that future dissolves, you're not just grieving what was, you're grieving what would have been, the places you thought you'd go together, the seasons you thought you'd share, the next steps you were already preparing to take. There's no way to fully explain this kind of loss to others, because it didn't happen on the outside. It happened internally. Impossibility. But that doesn't make it any less real. You let go of the person, you let go of the plan. But your mind still wanders down that path sometimes out of habit or memory or quiet wondering. This kind of residue also shows up in spaces that were once shared. A living room, a playlist, a familiar drive. You've reclaimed the space, you've adjusted, you've brought in new energy, and still there are corners where they feel close, not in a haunting way, just in the sense that you were once known there, or that you once knew them there. It can be startling how vivid memory becomes when it's tied to place. You're not reminiscing, you're just passing through. And yet the weight of association still brushes against you like dust in the air, settling softly before you even notice. For many, there is also the challenge of letting go when the other person hasn't, when their energy still circles around your life. through messages, through mutual connections, through the subtle ways people try to remain present, even after you've stepped away. It's not always overt. Sometimes it's just the awareness that they're still watching, still hoping, or still trying to re-enter through familiar openings. You don't engage. You hold your boundary. But part of you stays alert. Not because you want them back, but because your system learned to track them. And that tracking doesn't immediately stop, even when you've let go, even when the door is closed. Sometimes what you're trying to release is a version of the past that doesn't line up with what you know now. You remember something one way, but new information changes the context, and suddenly, the feelings you thought were resolved become unsettled again. It doesn't mean you were wrong, it just means your perspective is shifting. And in that shift, old memories stir. You might feel foolish, or angry, or quietly disoriented. You might find yourself trying to reprocess things that you thought were already healed. That's not regression. That's your mind doing its job, making space for a new understanding. You don't need to rush it. You just need to notice that change can reopen what once felt closed. Another form of this holding happens when you let go of someone who still needed something from you. Maybe they were struggling. Maybe they depended on you more than that they admitted. And even now, after you've stepped back, part of you still wonders if they're okay. Not because you want to return, but because your care didn't turn off when the relationship ended. You were used to watching over them, to being the one who noticed, who helped, who stayed. And even though you've told yourself it's no longer your role, your instincts haven't all caught up. You still listen for their footsteps, still glance toward the door, even though you know they're not coming. There's also a kind of emotional weight that stays behind when you've had to walk away without being understood. You explained, or maybe you didn't. But either way, they didn't really see you. They didn't grasp what it cost you to leave. And that lack of recognition leaves something behind. You don't want validation. You're not waiting for them to agree. But there's a hollow space where mutual understanding was supposed to be. And in that space, a kind of echo forms. A repetition of what you wish you could have conveyed. You're not trying to rewrite the past. But your system still carries the tension of being unseen. Letting go can also bring forward strange moments of guilt. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you're the one who moved on first. You feel lighter. You've healed. And yet, you know they haven't. Or maybe they're still reaching, still searching. And some part of you feels like you should have done more. Even when you did everything you could, even when staying would have hurt you. That kind of guilt is quiet, but persistent. It whispers that freedom comes at a cost. And part of your work is to gently remind yourself that you're not responsible for their healing, only your own. There's also the difficulty of letting go when something ended on good terms, when there was still love, still respect, but not enough compatibility to make it work. Those endings can be the hardest to release because nothing went wrong. No one betrayed anyone. You simply had to walk away from something that still held beauty. And in doing so, you carry both grief and gratitude at once. You know it was right. But it still hurts. You miss things that mattered, and sometimes your memory brings them back in detail. The softness, the laughter, the safety, not to tempt you, but to honor what once was. You let it go with love. But something in you is still learning how to live without it. At times, the hardest part isn't letting go of someone else, but letting go of the version of you that existed in that connection. Maybe you were more open, more expressive. Maybe you laughed more or felt more grounded. And now that it's over, you find yourself searching for that version again, not to relive the past, but to reclaim the parts of yourself that felt most alive. You're not holding on to them, but you haven't fully found your way back to them either. So you keep listening, watching, waiting for that spark of recognition. And until it comes, something in you feels slightly unfinished. The truth is, we don't always get clean endings. Not every story resolves. Not every bond breaks evenly. Sometimes we release someone long before we feel done. Sometimes we keep them close, long after we've said goodbye. There is no perfect rhythm, no correct sequence. Just the ongoing process of softening what once was. Some days you'll feel clear. Other days you'll feel pulled. That doesn't mean you're not healing. It just means you're human. And humans take time. There are also moments when letting go isn't a choice. It's something that happens to you. Someone leaves. A decision is made without your input. A chapter ends without warning. And you're left trying to catch up to a reality that you didn't ask for. In those situations, the gap between what you want and what's true can feel wide and quiet. You might accept the facts, you might speak the words, it's over, they're gone, it's done. And still, part of you hasn't caught up. Because your internal world was still in motion when the external world changed. The plans, the assumptions, the imagined timelines, that they were still unfolding. And now they're not. That kind of interruption leaves a specific kind of residue, not because you're clinging, but because your system was in the middle of a sentence when the story ended. Sometimes you're letting go of someone who was never fully yours, a connection that existed in liminal space, a closeness that hinted at something deeper but never declared itself. These bonds can be the hardest to release because you're not only grieving what was, but what almost was. You can't point to a moment where it ended because it never truly began. And yet, the impact is real. You shared space, emotion, vulnerability. You hoped, you waited. And when it faded, you were left with nothing to mark its place. No photos, no closure, just a quiet ache for something that hovered at the edge of becoming. You let go because there's nothing to hold. But part of you still wonders what would have happened if it had gone just a little further. In some cases, you're not even letting go of a person. You're letting go of a possibility of being chosen, of being understood, of being held in the way you needed. The face might change. The name might not matter. But the longing remains. And even after the specific person is gone, your heart continues to reach toward that unmet need, not in desperation, but in recognition. Because something wasn't fulfilled, something didn't land, and that hunger, that ache, stays active until it's met in some new form. It's not obsession, it's completion. Your system is looking for the thing it didn't receive, and until it finds something that resonates, part of you stays open, unfinished, waiting. Letting go also involves the subtle practice of releasing expectations, not only of others, but of yourself. You thought you'd handle things differently. You thought you'd feel stronger by now. You thought the process would be cleaner or faster or simpler. And when it's not, a quiet shame can creep in. As if the fact that something still stirs means you're not doing enough. But the truth is, healing doesn't respond to pressure. It unfolds on its own timeline. Your efforts matter. Your awareness matters. But the timeline is not yours to control. Expecting yourself to be over it by a certain point often delays the very release you're longing for. Letting go also means letting go of how you think letting go should look. Sometimes what makes it hard to release someone is the way they reflected something back to you. They saw you a certain way, held you in a certain light, and even if the relationship didn't last, you still miss how you felt in their presence. Maybe they made you feel interesting or safe or brave. Maybe they reminded you of a version of yourself you haven't accessed in a long time. And now that they're gone, you wonder if that version left with them. But it didn't. It's still there. It was always yours. They just happened to reflect it. And with time, you'll find other ways to reconnect to those parts. But in the meantime, it's okay to feel the absence, not because you want them back, but because you want to remember how it felt to be seen like that. There's also the subtle pull of unfinished repair. You had conflict, misunderstandings, moments that hurt more than they should have. And even though you've walked away, part of you still wishes things had ended with more clarity, more grace, more mutual care. You're not holding on to the person, but you're holding on to the part of yourself that wasn't heard. The version of you that wanted to stay kind, that wanted to leave gently. And when that isn't possible, something stays open. Not in longing, but in discomfort. Because the last word wasn't yours. Or maybe it was, but it didn't feel like the right one. And your mind replays it, trying to rewrite something that can no longer be edited. There are also moments when you realize that the bond was real, even if it was brief. We're taught to measure importance by duration. But some connections, even if they lasted only weeks or months, leave deep marks. You might find yourself thinking about someone who hasn't been in your life for years. And not because you want to return to them, but because the impact of their presence still ripples through you. You shared something significant. You changed in their orbit. And now, even though they're gone, something in you still responds to the shape they left behind. That's not weakness. That's memory. And memory is slow to release what mattered. Sometimes the hardest thing to release is a role you no longer play. Maybe you were the fixer, the helper, the one who held everything together. And now, having stepped out of that pattern, you feel untethered. Not because you want to go back, but because so much of your identity was tied to being needed. You're free now, but also uncertain. You don't know who you are without the demands, without the weight. And in that quiet, it's easy to feel lost. But that space isn't empty, it's becoming. It just takes time to adjust to a life that doesn't require your constant effort. You've let go of the struggle. But part of you still listens for the next crisis, the next pull, the next reason to prove your worth. You might also feel tension around the concept of being over it, as if healing should look like indifference, as if moving on means forgetting. But for many, healing looks more like soft remembrance, like being able to think of someone without bracing, like carrying a story without needing to tell it, like acknowledging what happened without reliving it. That kind of healing doesn't erase the past. It simply places it in a quieter part of your internal library. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means no longer needing to return to the same page. But even that takes time. And some days, you might still find your eyes drifting back, not because you're stuck, but because you're still integrating. There's also the way memory behaves during transition, how Right as you're finally moving forward, the past becomes suddenly vivid. You dream about them. You remember small, strange details. You feel a wave of emotion you hadn't expected. It's tempting to interpret this as a sign, but often it's simply the mind completing its filing process. Letting go brings old moments to the surface, not to pull you back, but to release what was buried. This resurgence of memory isn't regression, it's release, a final sorting, a way of closing the drawer. And after it passes, there's usually more space, more clarity, more room to breathe. There are even times when the letting go feels complete until it doesn't. You go weeks, maybe months, without thinking of them. You feel whole, you feel clear. And then something triggers you, an anniversary, a location, a scent, and suddenly they're back in your thoughts. Not because you miss them, not because you want them back, but because healing isn't linear. You've healed, yes, but the trace remains, and traces surface when they're touched. That doesn't undo your growth. It simply reminds you that memory isn't a wound. It's a record, and it can play without causing pain. Some people struggle to let go because they were never allowed to express the depth of their emotion. They had to hold it in, stay composed, be the strong one. And now, even though it's over, that bottled up energy still lives in their body. The words that they never said, the tears they never cried, the truths they swallowed. Letting go isn't just about mentally releasing, it's also about allowing those feelings to exist long enough to be felt. And when that hasn't happened, part of the experience remains suspended, waiting to be witnessed. Not to stir up suffering, but to complete the cycle that was never allowed to finish. You may also feel resistance when your letting go affects others. Maybe they were connected to the person you're walking away from. Mutual friends, shared spaces, collateral ties. And even though your decision is right, you know it will ripple outward. And that awareness creates hesitation. You don't want to hurt others. You don't want to be the cause of distance. And so part of you stays longer than you should, not in the bond, but in the discomfort, wondering how to navigate the aftermath, wondering how to honor yourself without disrupting others. You've let go, but the consequences of letting go still weigh on you. And that, too, takes time to resolve. Ultimately, letting go isn't about forgetting or erasing or suddenly becoming unaffected. It's about allowing space. Space for memory, space for grief, space for what was true and what will never be. It's about recognizing that some parts of you are slower to update than others. And that's okay. You're not behind, you're not broken, you're just real. And in your reality, things unfold quietly, gradually in their own rhythm. Letting go isn't a single act. It's a long, slow movement towards something lighter. Something that still holds truth but no longer holds weight. Something that can be remembered without needing to be held. There are times when the feeling of being done and the feeling of being free are not the same. You can be done with someone or something and still feel deeply entangled in it. You no longer want to go back. You've made peace with your decision, but your thoughts still pause at certain names. Your emotions still spike in specific situations. It isn't because you're unsure, it's because being done lives in the mind. And being free lives in the body. The body doesn't always let go just because you've decided to. It carries memory in ways that aren't logical. A scent, a sound, a season. And without warning, you're pulled for a moment into something you thought you'd already released. This isn't failure. It's just the slow recalibration between what you know and what you still feel. Sometimes you've moved on from a person, but not from the version of life you had with them. Maybe you liked who you were during that time, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you lost yourself in that chapter, and part of you is still angry about it, still trying to make sense of why you stayed, or why you tolerated things you would never accept now. Letting go in that sense is layered. It's not just about the other person, it's also about how you relate to the person you were when you loved them, the decisions you made, the beliefs you held, the way you saw yourself. You can't rewrite that part of your history, but you can meet it with understanding rather than judgment. You did what you could with what you knew, and part of letting go is accepting that version of yourself with quiet compassion, even if you've outgrown them. There's another kind of delay that comes from comparison. You see others who have seemingly moved on quickly. They seem light, unbothered, free. And even though you know people carry things differently, part of you wonders why it still feels heavy for you. You remind yourself that you're doing fine, that there's no rush. But still you wonder what you're doing wrong. The answer is usually nothing. Healing isn't a performance, and it rarely follows a straight line. You may not notice your own progress until one day you look back and realize something no longer stings the way it used to. And that moment will come, not because you forced it, but because you stayed present with yourself long enough to allow it. You might also struggle with letting go because of the way the story ended. Maybe it ended suddenly, or messily, or without answers, and you're left with 1,000 fragments that don't fit together. You replay them not because you want them back, but because your mind is trying to make sense of what felt senseless. You're trying to find the thread, the lesson, the shape, not to justify it, but to understand it. This search isn't about holding on, it's about making peace. And peace often requires clarity. But clarity doesn't always arrive. Sometimes all you get is silence, and your work becomes learning how to live with unanswered questions, how to hold the ambiguity without letting it harden you. You let go not because it made sense, but because it didn't, and you finally accepted that it never will. In other situations, the thing you're trying to release is more than a person or a story. It's an entire chapter of life, a time marked by a certain rhythm, a particular home, a set of routines. You've moved, changed, adjusted, and yet parts of your mind still operate as if that version of your life is ongoing. You remember what day it would have been. You picture how things would have unfolded. You track the timeline of something that no longer exists. This doesn't mean you're stuck. It means that your internal calendar hasn't finished syncing with your external reality. These shifts take time. Time to release the old scaffolding. Time to stop rehearsing a story that's no longer yours. You're not behind. You're simply in the process of catching up to yourself. Letting go also means untangling from hope. Not hope in general, but the kind of specific hope that kept you anchored to a particular outcome. You might not have realized how much you were still holding it until it started to fade. And when it does, it can feel like loss all over again. Not because you wanted the old story back, but because some part of you was still quietly waiting for a sign, for a message, for a shift. Hope is subtle like that. It doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just waits in the background, convinced there's still something left to resolve. Letting go of that hope can feel like a kind of death, a closing of a door that was never fully shut. It's tender, it's quiet, but it's necessary. And not to give up, but to allow new hope to take its place. There are moments when you've truly done the work. You've processed, you've healed, you've released, and yet something small still lives in the corners of your mind. A thought, a name, a reaction. It's not invasive. It doesn't dominate your experience, but it still visits from time to time, like a shadow passing through a familiar room. These remnants don't mean you're not healed. They mean you're human. The mind doesn't always delete things that no longer serve us. Sometimes it simply tucks them away, returns to them quietly, and then leaves again. You can be fully free and still carry traces. That's not contradiction, that's completion. You might also notice that letting go feels different in your body than it does in your mind. Your thoughts might be clear, your heart might feel ready, but your body might still carry the charge of certain moments. You feel it in tension, in dreams, in the way you flinch at sudden words or gestures. This isn't your fault, it's your system catching up. The body processes things slowly, especially when they were intense. It stores reactions like muscle memory. Not because it wants to hold on, but because it's trying to protect you. Over time, with safety and repetition, those physical responses soften. They begin to fade. But in the meantime, they're not signs of failure. They're signs of depth, of how fully you once experienced something and of how fully you're now releasing it. Sometimes the act of letting go is interrupted by new information, a message, a revelation, something that shifts your understanding. Suddenly, the story you thought was finished feels reopened. Not because you want it to be, but because the new context changes the way you see the past. This can feel destabilizing. You'd already made peace. You'd already filed it away. And now it's back on the table. But that doesn't mean you're starting over. It just means the healing is widening, making room for a more complete truth. You're not unraveling. You're expanding, revisiting, not to reattach, but to realign. Letting go can also be complicated by the presence of forgiveness. You might forgive someone long before you forget what they did. You might release your anger and still remember the feeling of betrayal. You might wish them well and still never want to see them again. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a process of loosening your grip, not for them, but for yourself. And even after you've done it, some tension might remain. You're not bitter. You're not stuck. You're just human. And humans remember where they were hurt, even after the wound is closed. There's also the quiet grief that comes from letting go of something that once felt safe, even if it later turned painful, even if it had to end. The early stages of a bond often carry warmth, excitement, hope, and those parts remain vivid, even as the later stages overshadow them. You're not idealizing. You're just remembering the full spectrum. Letting go doesn't mean denying the good. It means accepting that the good existed and still wasn't enough to sustain it. That duality is hard to hold, but it's part of healing. You can love who you were in those moments. You can thank them and still say goodbye. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is that it creates space, and space can be uncomfortable. You had someone to think about, to worry over, to plan around, and now there's nothing in that slot, no one occupying that mental real estate. And in that emptiness, you may feel lonely or restless or unmoored. It's not because you want to fill it again immediately. It's just because your mind was used to the presence of someone else. And absence, even when chosen, takes time to normalize. You're not regressing, you're adjusting. And that discomfort isn't a sign to go back. It's a sign that you're in transition. There are also moments when letting go feels too quiet. You expected a shift, a moment of clarity, a burst of relief, but instead it feels flat, ordinary, like nothing changed. And you wonder if you did it right. But often, true release happens subtly. It's not a dramatic wave, it's a gentle loosening, a soft exhale, a moment when you realize that you haven't thought about them all day, or that something that once hurt now passes by unnoticed. Those moments may not feel significant at the time, but they are. They're the real markers of progress, not the big breakthroughs, but the quiet, steady returns to yourself. The places where weight used to live, and now there's space. There's something else that happens in the quiet aftermath of letting go, a kind of identity pause. You knew who you were in relation to them. You knew what your role was, even if it was one you no longer wanted. And now, without that dynamic, there's a small disorientation. You are still you, of course, but different. And not all the new parts have arrived yet. Letting go often comes before becoming. Before the new friendships, before the new rhythm, before the next chapter really takes shape. You've stepped away from what no longer fits, but you haven't fully stepped into what comes next. That in-between place can feel lonely. Not because you want to return, but because becoming someone new takes time. And sometimes before you build, you simply wait. You might also notice that letting go doesn't just impact how you feel about others. It reshapes how you see yourself. After a breakup, after a falling out, after a major shift, your self-image can wobble. You ask yourself new questions. Was I too much? Not enough? Did I miss something obvious? Or maybe you replay the version of yourself you were in their presence and wonder how that version even came to be. It can be unsettling to realize how deeply we adapt to the people we care about. And when they're gone, it's like pieces of you no longer know what to do. But over time, those pieces find new arrangements, new expressions. The part of you that felt safest with them begins to look for new places to land. And eventually it does. Sometimes letting go means letting go of the narrative you've carried. The one where you were wronged, or misunderstood, or left behind. The one where you replay how unfair it was or how much you gave. That story might be true. It might even be necessary for a time to understand, to process, to grieve. But eventually it begins to wear on you, not because it's untrue, but because it's heavy, and retelling it doesn't bring relief. It just reactivates the ache. Letting go then becomes not about excusing what happened, but about releasing the need to stay inside the same frame. You step outside it, you see it from a distance, and slowly it becomes part of your history, not your identity. There are other times when you haven't even realized you're still holding on, until something small brings it back. A name in a conversation, a photo you weren't expecting, a piece of music that suddenly feels like a time machine. And in that moment you feel it, the sharpness, the softness, the unfinished breath. It doesn't mean you're still attached. It doesn't mean you haven't grown. It just means that memory still lives somewhere in you, untouched. And when it's stirred, it speaks. Not to pull you backward, but to remind you that your past self once lived fully inside that moment. You don't have to do anything with that reminder. You can just let it pass, like weather, like wind. Sometimes we delay letting go because we're afraid of losing the meaning that came with the connection. If you release the person, does that erase what they meant to you? If you stop thinking about it, does that make it seem like it never mattered? These quiet fears can keep us orbiting long after the story has ended. But meaning doesn't require maintenance. Something can matter and still be over. Something can shape you deeply and still be done. You don't have to keep carrying it in your hands for it to stay part of your story. It's already there. Letting go doesn't take that away. It simply gives you space to hold other things. There's also the matter of timing. You may have waited too long or not long enough. You may have said things too late or too soon. You may wish you'd handled things differently. And part of you might hold on just to stay near the version of yourself who didn't know better yet. As if by staying close to the past, you can somehow protect the person you were or undo what's already been done. But you can't go back and fix it. You can only let that version of you rest. They did what they could, and now it's your turn to take what they learned and carry it forward with a little more kindness. Sometimes the reason letting go feels impossible is because something in you is still waiting to be picked, to be chosen, to be understood in a way you weren't. The bond is over, but the desire for recognition is still alive. And when that desire isn't met, it can feel like an unfinished sentence. You let go of the person, but you're still hoping that somehow they'll circle back and say the one thing you needed to hear, that they saw you, that you mattered, that they understood you better than they showed. And maybe they never will. But even that doesn't have to keep you tethered. Because sometimes what they couldn't give, you can still give to yourself. Not all at once, but gently in the space they left behind. Letting go also changes how you interact with the future. You begin to approach new people with more awareness, sometimes with more caution. You might hesitate before opening up, or take longer to trust. That's not a flaw, that's the result of being reshaped. You've walked through something, and now you're different. That doesn't mean closed. It just means more attuned, more aware of your own boundaries, of what you need, of what you can't repeat. Letting go doesn't just remove something. It creates space for new clarity, for choices that come from who you are now, not who you were then. You might also find that certain moments bring old feelings back, even if the person who caused them is long gone. That's because the emotional response isn't always tied to the person, it's tied to the pattern. If someone once made you feel small or dismissed or invisible, and you encounter that energy again in a new situation, the old feeling returns. You're not holding on to them. You're holding on to the residue of how you were made to feel. And letting go in that case means going inward, finding that part of yourself that felt overlooked and bringing it back into focus, into value, into light, so that the next time it's tested, you remember not just what happened, but what you no longer accept. There's also a kind of holding on that comes from habit, not from desire. You wake up thinking about them. You replay scenarios automatically, not because you want them back, but because they became part of your mental landscape. And even after they leave, the grooves of thought remain. The same way you might reach for a light switch in a room that no longer exists. These patterns fade, but they don't vanish overnight. You can't rush their disappearance, but you can meet them with softness when they appear. And eventually the pattern fades from lack of use. Not because you pushed it away, but because your mind simply stopped needing it. Sometimes the most surprising part of letting go is how ordinary it eventually becomes. There was a time when thinking of them brought tears or tightness or a long pause, and then one day it just doesn't. Their name comes up and it passes through you like any other word. You hear the song and it doesn't sting. You see their face and it doesn't shake you. It's not that they've disappeared from your story, it's that your story has expanded so far beyond them, they no longer define it. That kind of freedom arrives quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, just a moment of stillness where you realize you finally made it across. Letting go, in the end, isn't a single act. It's not a clean break or a simple choice. It's 100 small shifts, 1,000 tiny permissions. The slow loosening of something that once felt necessary. And over time, what once occupied so much space becomes just one part of the background. It no longer commands your attention. It no longer colors every decision. It becomes quiet, still, complete. And in that quiet, you notice what else is possible, what else is present, what else might be waiting. Not to replace what was, but to accompany what is. Sometimes what you're letting go of isn't about one person or one moment. It's about a collection of subtle experiences that shaped you over time. The tone of someone's voice when they doubted you. The way someone's absence taught you not to expect consistency. The look someone gave you that made you feel too much or not enough. These are not dramatic events. They're not things you tell stories about. But they build layers. Layers that you later spend years peeling back. And even when the people are long gone, the responses remain. You let go of the relationship. You move past the context. But something in your body still flinches, still scans, still waits. Not because you want to hold on, but because these traces were woven in gradually, quietly. And they require just as much quiet care to unweave. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with realizing someone isn't who you thought they were. Maybe you built an image around them of who they were or what the connection meant. And maybe that image wasn't wrong at the time. But people change or reveal. And when that image starts to collapse, it can feel like losing them all over again. You're not letting go of a person exactly. You're letting go of an idea, a projection, a hoped-for version. And even if the truth is clearer now, even if you feel safer without the illusion, it can still hurt. Because something in you believed. Something in you trusted. And now, something in you has to rebuild without that structure. That process isn't a failure of judgment. It's a normal part of learning who people really are. Especially when your heart has been involved. Sometimes the thing you're letting go of is a role you were never meant to play. The one who fixes, the one who smooths things over, the one who absorbs the weight so others can breathe. You may have taken on that role because it was needed, or because no one else would, or because for a while it made you feel valuable, but over time, it can become exhausting. Quietly, invisibly, it wears you down. And when you finally start to step out of it, something surprising happens. You feel guilt or discomfort or a strange kind of emptiness. Because you were so used to being that person, it's hard to remember who you are without the responsibility. Letting go of that role isn't just about stopping the behavior. It's about rewriting the internal narrative that said you were only lovable when you were useful. You might also discover that letting go triggers a fear of emptiness. When something occupied your thoughts, your time, your heart, even if it was difficult, It filled space, and now that it's gone, the space feels vast, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. You might try to fill it quickly with something new or distract from it entirely. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let the space stay empty for a while, to see what grows there when it isn't being covered, to learn that emptiness isn't a punishment, it's potential. It's the pause before a new rhythm. And if you can stay long enough without rushing to fill it, you might find that the emptiness becomes peace. Not because you made it go away, but because you stopped treating it like a problem. There are moments when the person you're letting go of has already left you behind. They've moved on, they've changed their life. They no longer think of you. And you know this. But something in you still circles. Not around them necessarily, but around the version of yourself that loved them. You feel protective of that version, loyal to them, and letting go feels like abandoning who you were when you cared the most. But you're not betraying yourself. By releasing that story, you're honoring it by allowing it to end. That version of you was real. They mattered, and now they can rest. You're allowed to move forward without waiting for someone who isn't looking back. Sometimes what lingers isn't even about love. It's about injustice, about the way things ended, the silence, the denial, the way they walked away without acknowledgement or apology or care. And you're not trying to hold on. You're just trying to make sense of how something that mattered so much could be dismissed so easily. That dissonance is hard to hold. It makes you question everything. But it's not yours to carry. The way someone exits says more about them than it does about the story you shared. Letting go doesn't mean you have to excuse it. It just means you choose not to carry their absence like a wound. There's a particular stillness that arrives once you've truly begun to release. A kind of quietness inside. At first, it might feel strange. You've been used to the background noise, the rehearsed conversations, the imagined scenarios, the wondering. And then slowly, that noise fades. Not all at once, but enough for you to notice the difference. Enough for you to sit with yourself and not feel the pull of what was. You realize you're not checking anymore, not scanning, not waiting. The energy you once gave away is starting to return to you. And in that stillness, something new begins to grow. Not joy, necessarily, not yet, but room. Room for whatever comes next. You might even reach a place where you can look back and feel nothing sharp, nothing urgent, just a soft awareness of what was. You remember them. You remember who you were. But it doesn't take you under. It doesn't derail your day. That's not forgetting. That's healing. And it doesn't mean you no longer care. It means your care no longer costs you peace. That's what letting go really does. It gives you back your own mind, your own rhythm, your own breath, so that you can live forward, not in resistance to the past, but in quiet coexistence with it. Letting go is not about pretending. It's not about telling yourself that you never cared or that it didn't matter or that you're over it when you're not. It's about being honest with where you are, with what still stirs, with what still visits, and then gently choosing not to follow it, choosing not to feed the loop. You can feel something without clinging to it. You can remember without returning. That's where freedom lives, not in never being touched by the past, but in no longer being held by it. Eventually, you might even thank the experience, not because you wanted it, not because it was fair, but because it showed you something about yourself, about what you need. about what you'll never settle for again. That kind of gratitude doesn't erase the pain, but it softens it. It gives it context. It makes space for meaning, not justification, but meaning. And that can be enough. Enough to make peace, enough to rest, and then one day, without realizing it, you will have moved on. Not with ceremony, not with certainty, but with softness, like a tide that shifts direction without needing to explain itself. You'll wake up and the weight will be gone. You'll hear their name and it won't echo. You'll pass the place and your chest won't tighten. Not because you forced it, but because time and presence and care have done their work. Letting go will have happened somewhere deep and quiet, below the level of thought, not as an action, but as a state of being free. There's a kind of quiet clarity that begins to emerge as you settle into this freedom. You notice how much energy you used to spend circling the same thoughts, how much space a single person or a single hope once occupied in your mental world. And now that the weight is gone, you feel it, not just the absence of pain, but the presence of possibility. You begin to notice things again. Small things. You hear your own voice more clearly. You pay attention to your surroundings in a way that feels different. You begin to respond instead of react, to choose instead of compensate. This is not a dramatic transformation. It's gentle, subtle, but unmistakable. You are returning to yourself. In this space, memories may still visit. They don't stop showing up entirely, but they lose their charge. They pass through like clouds. They no longer alter your mood or shake your confidence. They're just part of your story now. No more, no less. There's no need to push them away. You don't need to manage them anymore. They arise, they dissolve, and you remain steady. That's how you know something has changed. When the past no longer has the power to pull you out of the present. When remembering doesn't cost you anything. Sometimes you might be surprised by how neutral it all begins to feel. There was a time when the idea of moving on seemed impossible. It felt like betrayal or denial or abandonment. And now it just feels quiet. Not cold, not indifferent, just quiet. The thoughts come less often, the emotions don't grip as tightly, there's no resistance left, no need to make sense of it anymore. You've stopped reaching for answers that never arrived. You've stopped hoping for conversations that never came. And in that release, you've made room for yourself. The version of you that isn't shaped by what was lost, but by what has remained. Letting go doesn't make the past irrelevant. It doesn't undo the connection or erase the meaning. It simply releases the need to keep holding it in the foreground. It lets the experience move to its natural place in your timeline. You stop building your days around what once was. You stop measuring your growth by how far you are from a person or a story or a memory. You start choosing from the present, responding to what's here, living from the inside out, not the outside in. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. You're no longer driven by reaction. You're guided by alignment, by clarity, by a sense of inner steadiness that doesn't depend on the past behaving a certain way. There's also the realization that closure was never something they could give you. You waited perhaps, hoped maybe, for a final conversation, an apology, an explanation, and then one day you realized you weren't waiting for them. You were waiting for yourself, for the moment when you no longer needed anything from them in order to be whole. That kind of closure doesn't arrive in words. It arrives in silence, in stillness, in the deep knowing that you don't need to carry the unfinished parts anymore. You don't need them to tie the bow. You've already closed the chapter from within. In this space, your past becomes something you can hold lightly. You see the patterns, the lessons, the ways you showed up that no longer serve you, and instead of judging, you notice. You adjust, you keep what aligns, you release what no longer does. There's no urgency to heal, no pressure to be over it. Just a calm awareness of your own becoming. A quiet trust in your ability to feel things fully and still find your way back to peace. That's the core of true release, not perfection, but presence. Not control, but compassion. You may also begin to notice how different your energy feels around others. You're no longer leaking attention into invisible threads that connect you to unresolved places. You're not constantly checking in with a part of you that's still tangled in what was. And so you show up more clearly, more fully. You listen differently, speak differently, love differently. Not because you've hardened, but because you've softened in the right places, because you're not carrying stories that don't belong to you anymore. You're not performing versions of yourself that were shaped in survival. You're simply being. And that presence feels safe to you and to the people around you. Eventually, letting go stops being something you're doing. It becomes something you've done, a shift that lives in your nervous system, not just in your thoughts. You stop reminding yourself that it's over because there's nothing left to remind. You stop avoiding triggers because they no longer trigger anything. You stop waiting for time to finish what presence has already completed. And in that place, something remarkable happens. You begin to trust yourself again, deeply, quietly. You trust your choices, your boundaries, your ability to hold space for your own experience. You no longer need anyone else to reflect your worth back to you. You know it from within. And when that becomes your baseline, not a temporary state, but a stable foundation, you begin to relate to the past in a new way, not as something to resist or relive, but as something that simply was. It happened, it shaped you, it ended, and you're still here, not just surviving it, but changed by it, grown by it, strengthened through it. You no longer define yourself by what you let go of. You define yourself by what you allowed in once the letting go was complete. That's the final shift. When your focus turns toward what's emerging, not what's missing. You begin to see what fits, what soothes, what supports the person you've become. You move toward people who feel easy, situations that feel aligned, environments that let you breathe. You no longer chase intensity or stories to fix. You choose what nourishes you, what reflects your clarity. And you do it without fanfare, without needing anyone's approval. You've let go of the old gravity, the old ache that made you think love had to come with difficulty. Now you know something different. You know peace. And you're learning to recognize it, even in its quietest forms. Somewhere in the quiet aftermath of all this release, you begin to notice something new. A deeper ease in your body, a lightness in your thinking, a calm steadiness that stays, even when things are uncertain. You're not waiting for something to return anymore. You're not scanning for signs. You're not rehearsing old conversations. What used to pull your attention now passes through like background noise. There, but no longer compelling. This is not because you've forgotten or because you've hardened. It's because the story has found its place and you've allowed yourself to live beyond it. You may even find yourself being surprised by how long you carried something that no longer belonged to you. A memory, a tension, a hope. And now that it's gone, it's easier to see the weight it had. Not in a way that brings regret, but in a way that brings understanding. You held on for as long as you needed to. And when you didn't need to anymore, you didn't force it. You simply loosened your grip, little by little, without trying to prove anything. You let it go. That's how most things leave us. Quietly, when we are ready, not before. You might also notice that your inner world feels more spacious. There's room now. Room to feel without collapsing. Room to remember without spiraling. Room to imagine something new without immediately comparing it to what came before. This is a sign that your nervous system has softened, that your mind has exhaled, that you are no longer orienting around the absence of something, but around the presence of yourself. This kind of shift is subtle but deep. It doesn't always come with fireworks. Often it arrives in the middle of an ordinary day. You're doing something simple, washing dishes, walking home, folding laundry, and you realize it doesn't hurt anymore. You're not waiting anymore. You're just here, fully. Sometimes people will still ask about what happened, or the person, or the chapter you've left behind. And you'll be surprised to hear your own voice. How calm it sounds, how simple the words are. You don't need to explain as much. You don't need to defend. You've let go of the need to convince anyone, yourself included, of why it had to end. The ending speaks for itself now, and your peace is its own kind of explanation. You're not distant. You're just no longer tangled. You're no longer living in a conversation that has already ended. And what replaces all of this isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's a sense of neutrality. Sometimes it's small joys, things you used to overlook when your mind was crowded. A favorite song, the way sunlight moves across your room, a quiet morning where nothing hurts. You don't need everything to be perfect. You just notice that your baseline has changed. The background static is gone. You can hear your own thoughts clearly again. You can feel your emotions without fear. You can be in your life without bracing. That's what letting go gives you. Not just freedom from the past, but access to the present. Eventually, the story becomes one you carry, but no longer one you tell. Not because it isn't worth sharing, but because it no longer defines your narrative. It's just part of your timeline, a thread among many, and you start to feel more interested in what's ahead. Not in a rushed way, not as a distraction, but as a natural unfolding. You've cleared the space, you've done the work, and now you're available for what's next. Open in a way that doesn't feel forced, receptive in a way that feels safe. What's beautiful about this place is that you didn't earn it through force. You didn't demand it. You didn't rush toward it. You arrived because you stayed present. You allowed. You listened. You gave yourself time. And in doing so, you built a kind of trust with yourself that no one can take away. The kind of trust that comes from knowing you can survive endings. You can hold yourself through transitions. You can face uncertainty without unraveling. That's what true letting go makes possible. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of resilience. And in that resilience, there's softness. You're not brittle. You're not guarded. You're just grounded, rooted in your own truth, open to life as it is, not as you hoped it would be. And that openness creates connection. The kind that doesn't come from needing or fixing or proving, but from simply being present, being real, being willing to meet people in moments without carrying the shadows of what came before. This is the quiet reward of letting go. Not dramatic change, not instant clarity, but gentle return. A return to yourself, a return to ease, a return to the life that was waiting for you all along, beneath the noise, a life that doesn't require you to carry everything, a life that welcomes you exactly as you are, unburdened, unhurried, and finally free. You may come to realize that some of the strongest parts of you were shaped not by what you held on to, but by what you released. The act of letting go, especially when it wasn't easy, created space within you for something softer, something wiser. You no longer rush toward resolution. You no longer panic when something ends. You understand now that not everything needs to be understood right away. Not every feeling needs to be acted on. Not every goodbye needs to be explained. Some things simply pass through. They arrive, they change you, and they move on, and you remain. Quietly, fully, calmly, you remain. This isn't a return to who you used to be. It's not about reclaiming an old version of yourself that existed before the pain. It's about allowing a new version to emerge, one shaped not in spite of what happened, but gently alongside it. You carry the memories, but they are no longer in charge. You remember the lessons, but they are no longer heavy. You're not trying to be who you were before. You're allowing who you are now to take shape without resistance. Letting go has made room for this self to arrive. There are still days when the echoes return. Not because something is wrong, but because echoes are part of memory. You may hear their name. You may feel a familiar ache rise for just a moment. You may even wonder what they're doing, how they've changed. But it doesn't carry you anymore. It doesn't take you under. It's just a wave passing through the wide ocean of your mind. It moves, and then it's gone. You breathe. You're here, still grounded, still whole. You might also start to notice the quality of your new choices. How you don't entertain what drains you anymore. How you walk away sooner from situations that confuse your peace. How you ask better questions, not just of others, but of yourself. You don't just ask, do they love me? You ask, do I feel safe here? Can I be myself here? Do I trust the way I show up when I'm with them? These shifts are quiet, but powerful. They are the markers of growth. They signal a deeper relationship with yourself, one built not from control, but from clarity. Letting go also changes the way you love. You love with less urgency now, less attachment. Not because you care less, but because you've learned that true connection doesn't require gripping. You don't rush to prove. You don't rush to hold. You allow. You observe. You respond. There's a softness to your presence now. A steadiness that doesn't come from certainty, but from trust. Trust that what's meant for you won't require you to abandon yourself to keep it. Trust that the right things come with a rhythm that your nervous system can actually breathe with. You may also notice that you've started creating things again, a little more freely, writing, drawing, moving, speaking, without the heavy filter of self-doubt. Not because you're suddenly full of confidence, but because the internal noise has lessened. You're not trying to prove as much anymore. You're not trying to fix yourself with every act of expression. You're simply being, exploring, making space for what wants to move through you. This is what happens when energy returns. When attention that was once tied up in loops is released back into your own creative field. There's space to build again, to imagine, to begin. There's also more compassion now, not just for others, but for yourself. You can look back on the version of you who stayed too long, or gave too much, or trusted too easily, and instead of cringing, you feel warmth. That person wasn't weak. That person was trying. They loved. They hoped. They believed. And even if it didn't end the way they wanted, they were brave enough to open. That matters. That version of you matters. And the one you are now honors them, not by resenting the past, but by choosing better now, by choosing with love, not fear. Eventually, even your language changes. You stop saying, I should have known. You start saying, I understand more now. You stop saying, I was so foolish. You start saying, I was learning. These aren't just softer phrases. They are reflections of a deeper truth, that you've outgrown the need to punish yourself for growing. You can see your path as a progression, not a mistake. A movement towards self-awareness, one imperfect step at a time. Letting go of shame is one of the quietest and most important parts of healing. It makes space for joy, for self-respect, for ease. And with that ease comes new boundaries. Not the hard, defensive kind, but the calm, grounded kind. The kind that says, this is what I have space for. The kind that doesn't need justification. The kind that comes from listening to yourself consistently over time. You no longer bend just to be chosen. You no longer perform just to be liked. You let people meet you where you are, or not at all. And that clarity frees everyone. You're not afraid of who leaves, because you know you're not abandoning yourself in order to be kept. This is what letting go eventually teaches you, that you are enough on your own, that your peace is not fragile, that your worth was never tied to what stayed or what left. You begin to recognize your own energy more clearly, the way your body feels when something is aligned, the way your chest tightens when something isn't. You don't argue with those signals anymore. You listen, you adjust, you walk away, you stay. You make decisions from the inside, not based on fear or longing or fantasy. That's freedom. And it feels different than anything that came before. The more you trust this rhythm, the less you chase. You stop needing so much from the outside world to feel okay. You stop asking for signs. You stop looking backwards. You're not avoiding the past. You're simply not consulting it for instructions anymore. Your direction comes from somewhere quieter now, somewhere more honest, somewhere rooted not in lack, but in self-connection. You're no longer performing for peace. You are peace. And that realization changes everything. Not in one instant, but in a slow, steady unfolding that feels both familiar and brand new. Over time, you start to notice the subtler signs of your own growth. You're no longer drawn to chaos. You no longer confuse intensity with depth. You no longer stay in places that require you to shrink in order to be accepted. These shifts don't always feel dramatic. They don't announce themselves. They arrive in the form of ease. You walk away without needing a final word. You say no without guilt. You hear an old name and feel nothing but a small, distant echo. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines the emotional landscape you live in. This is the reward of letting go, not forgetting, not erasing, but evolving. You may also find yourself reflecting on how many parts of you were once shaped by someone else's expectations. How much of your identity was built around being easy to love, being good, being agreeable, being useful. And now as you slowly remove those layers, what's left is something quieter, but more true. You stop asking, am I what they want? And begin asking, am I being honest with myself? That shift is subtle, but it brings a kind of self-respect that no external validation can compete with. You don't need to prove anymore. You just need to be present with what's real. Letting go teaches you to relate to endings differently. You no longer see them as failures. You see them as part of the rhythm of living. Some things complete. Some things dissolve. Some people pass through you like seasons, brief, vivid, important, and then they move on. Not because you did something wrong, but because that was the length of their chapter in your story. And that's okay. You don't have to stretch every experience into forever in order for it to have value. What mattered. Even if it ended, even if they never saw you clearly, even if it didn't unfold the way you thought it would, it still changed you. It still moved you. It still taught you something. And you're allowed to carry the beauty of that without needing to carry the weight of it too. Eventually you stop asking what they're thinking. You stop imagining how things could have gone differently. You stop waiting for something, an apology, a recognition, a moment of clarity to arrive from them. Not because you no longer care, but because you've realized that your healing isn't dependent on their understanding. You may still wish they had seen you more clearly. You may still feel sadness that they didn't. But you no longer believe that their failure to understand you says anything about your worth. You've stopped outsourcing your peace to their insight. And in doing so, you've reclaimed something essential. And then slowly, something else begins to shift. You start to feel more rooted in the present, not just intellectually, but viscerally. You stop checking for updates on them, on the past, on the version of you that existed back then. You start noticing your own life again. How it feels to be in your own skin, how it feels to spend time alone and not feel restless, how it feels to make decisions that come from grounded clarity, not from needing to please or repair or perform. You're not watching your life through the lens of what's missing anymore. You're inhabiting it fully, as it is, with all its unknowns, with all its unfolding. There's a moment when you realize you don't want to go back, even if you could. Not because it was terrible, not because you hate what happened, but because who you are now has no place there anymore. You've grown, and growth makes certain returns impossible, not out of bitterness, but out of natural evolution. You outgrow what required you to abandon yourself. You outgrow what taught you to silence your needs. You outgrow what once felt like home, but now feels too small. And that's not rejection. That's becoming. That's the quiet gift of release. What remains after all of this is something quieter than you expected. It's not triumph. It's not resolution. It's not some final moment of clarity. It's space, stillness, presence. You can sit with yourself and feel at ease. You can look ahead without needing to know what's coming. You can look back without being pulled. That stillness isn't emptiness, it's a foundation. And on that foundation, you begin to build again. Not with urgency, not with desperation, but with care, with intention, with the quiet wisdom that comes from everything you've walked through. Letting go didn't mean losing something. It meant returning to yourself, piece by piece, gently, honestly, at the pace your heart could handle. And now that you're here, you see it differently. Not as a wound, but as a turning point. Not as a story of pain, but as a story of return. Not about what left, but about what stayed. About what's always been inside you, waiting to be heard again. And the more you listen, the more you'll notice. Life moves differently when you're no longer carrying what isn't yours. everything feels a little lighter. Not because there's no weight, but because you've stopped holding it all alone. You're supported now by your own boundaries, your own clarity, your own trust. The world hasn't changed, but you have. And that changes everything. There will still be moments when your past brushes against the present. A song, a date, a phrase someone says that sounds just like them. These moments don't always disappear, but they soften. They arrive with less intensity. They no longer demand your attention. You notice them and then you move on. You no longer feel pulled to interpret their meaning. You don't spiral into memory. You don't wonder if it's a sign. It's just something that once was, something that passed through you, something that left its shape but no longer defines your form. This is what peace feels like. Not the absence of all memory, but the absence of disturbance. And when those moments come, you no longer react as you once did. You don't flinch. You don't brace. You meet them with stillness. You welcome them like you would a breeze through an open window, brief, passing, harmless. Your body doesn't tighten anymore. Your breath stays slow. Your mind doesn't race to find a reason. You've trained yourself gently to remain, to stay grounded, to let things visit without letting them take over. And in doing so, you've rewired something essential. You've proven to yourself that you are no longer at the mercy of what used to break you. Letting go gives you access to a different kind of quiet. Not silence, but rest. Not emptiness, but space. You can sit in your own company without needing to fill the silence. You can go hours without wondering what someone else thinks of you. You can move through a day without being dragged backward. You're still aware of the past, but you're no longer managed by it. It doesn't need to be healed every day. It doesn't need to be solved. It's just there, like a photo in a drawer. Important, but no longer in your hands. You also begin to make decisions differently, with less panic, less urgency. You don't rush toward what feels familiar. You don't settle just to avoid discomfort. You've learned to pause, to wait, to listen. You trust that clarity arrives when you make space for it, that your body gives signals worth honoring, that your intuition grows louder in stillness. You've stopped overriding yourself just to make something work. That habit has faded. In its place is something slower, something more self-honoring. You walk away from confusion sooner. You stay with alignment longer. These small shifts add up. They become a new pattern, a new rhythm, new way of being. And what you find as you continue in this rhythm is that life doesn't require you to be on guard all the time. You don't need to over-explain your past. You don't need to convince anyone of your worth. You're not protecting yourself in every interaction. You're just showing up. Honestly. Calmly. As you are. Because you've already survived what you thought would undo you. And now you trust that you can handle whatever comes. Not because you're invincible, but because you're present. Present enough to notice. Present enough to choose. Present enough to respond without abandoning yourself. Letting go also allows you to re-enter old spaces with a new self. You may return to a place, a group, a memory, and find that it no longer holds power. You're not avoiding it anymore, but you're not defined by it either. You see it through new eyes. You breathe differently in that space. You don't try to recapture the past. You don't shrink to fit the old shape. You bring your current self into that place, and you notice what still fits and what doesn't. That's integration, not cutting parts off, but including them without being ruled by them. And eventually you realize that letting go wasn't about forgetting them. It was about remembering you, about giving yourself back to yourself. The attention, the care, the energy that was once wrapped around someone else's presence has returned. It's yours again. And you use it wisely now. You guard it gently. You pour it into things that nourish you, people who meet you, spaces that support you. You don't give it away so easily anymore. Not because you're closed, but because you've learned the value of your own peace. You may even start to see the person or situation that once took up so much space with neutrality, no longing, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that they were part of your story, but not the whole of it. They weren't your ending. They weren't your definition. They were a chapter. And chapters, by their nature, conclude. You don't hate them. You don't idolize them. You simply see them clearly now, as they were, as you were, and you allow the story to rest. This clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, over days, over choices, over repetitions of choosing peace, over rumination, choosing self-respect over re-engagement, choosing stillness over chasing. And eventually it becomes natural, effortless, like muscle memory. You don't think about letting go anymore. You just live. You just move. You just breathe. Without the constant tug of what's behind you. And when you look forward, it's with soft eyes. You no longer demand certainty. You don't need promises. You just want alignment. You want presence. You want what feels clear, calm, and kind. You're not building your future as a reaction to the past. You're creating it from your center, from what feels true today. And that's enough. You are enough. Not because someone told you, but because you remembered. Because you let go of what made you forget. As this new version of yourself settles in, you begin to recognize how different life feels when your energy isn't tied up in resistance. You're not fighting your memories. You're not fighting your feelings. You're not fighting the urge to make something make sense. There's a softness to your day-to-day now. A quiet inner space that isn't filled with questions you've already answered. You're not bracing for loss anymore. You're not rehearsing old patterns. You're just meeting the moment for what it is. No more, no less. You also become more selective. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. You recognize now that not everything deserves your time. Not everyone deserves your explanation. You begin to move with a sense of quiet discernment. You notice what energizes you and what drains you, what invites openness and what contracts your chest. What brings out the version of you that feels at home in your body and what does not? You don't need to make it dramatic. You don't need to announce your exit. You simply stop feeding what no longer feeds you. It's not a wall. It's a choice. Letting go has changed your relationship with need. You used to reach for certain connections out of scarcity because something in you believed that wholeness came from being seen, being wanted, being chosen. And now you understand that being chosen means nothing if you're abandoning yourself in the process. You'd rather be alone in your truth than partnered in your performance. That realization sets you free because it means that when love does come again, if it does, it will be met by the version of you who no longer disappears to be loved. And when the echoes of the past arise, because they still might, you don't panic. You don't spiral. You greet them like old visitors. You nod at them gently. You let them pass. There is no battle now, just awareness, just the soft understanding that nothing in you needs to be erased to be at peace. The past happened, it left marks, but it no longer shapes your movement, it no longer has your voice. This inner quiet is not emptiness, it's presence, a sense of being here, now, without being pulled in every direction by unfinished emotional threads. You're not waiting for a message or an apology or a signal from the universe that it's time to move on. You already have. Quietly, repeatedly, in all the small choices that brought you back to yourself. There is no more convincing, no more circling, just breath, just space, just now. And in this now, you begin to relate differently, not just to others, but to yourself. You speak more kindly to your mind. You allow your emotions to visit without judgment. You notice your triggers and your softness and your rhythms, and you stop trying to make them more palatable. You accept your edges, your pace, your needs. You take up space without needing a reason. You say yes when it's a full yes. You say no without explanation. Not because you don't care, but because you do, deeply. And now that care includes you. Letting go also reveals what you were never meant to carry. You look back and see all the weight you once held, thinking it was love, thinking it was loyalty, thinking it was strength. And now you understand. It was survival, it was coping, it was the best you could do with what you knew then. And there's no shame in that, but you don't carry it forward. You don't confuse pain with proof anymore. You don't confuse holding on with devotion. You know now that release can be the highest form of respect. Respect for the story, respect for yourself, respect for what no longer aligns. There may still be moments of sadness, not because you want to return, but because you loved, because you cared, because you tried. And even now, you carry the echoes of what you hoped it would become. That's not weakness, that's evidence of your capacity, your openness, your willingness to feel deeply even in uncertainty. Letting go didn't change your nature. It just brought your attention back to where it belongs, to the parts of you that are still here, still whole, still worthy. And one day, without realizing it, you will notice that you've stopped measuring distance from the past. You're no longer tracking how long it's been or how much it still lingers. You're just living. You're in your day, in your skin, in your breath. You're not proving that you've healed. You're simply being, without resistance, without explanation, without the low hum of emotional noise in the background. And that state, quiet, unforced, unguarded, is what peace feels like when it finally arrives. Not loud, not perfect, just steady, just real, just yours. You may also realize that letting go didn't just free you from the weight of a specific connection. It changed the way you relate to the entire idea of attachment. You begin to see that many of the things you once chased were not really about the people or situations themselves, but about how you wanted to feel seen, safe, understood. And now, with distance, you can separate the person from the feeling. You can acknowledge that they represented something, they mirrored something, but they were never the source. That's why the attachment lingered even after the story ended. Not because they were right for you, but because the feeling you wanted still hadn't found a home within you. With that clarity, something shifts. You stop assigning roles to others that they never agreed to play. You stop waiting for someone else to unlock what you're capable of giving yourself. You no longer confuse longing with alignment. You no longer confuse familiarity with compatibility. You don't need the old connection to return. in order to feel whole. You can feel the absence of it, even miss it at times, without mistaking that feeling for a reason to go back. This is how you learn the difference between love and attachment. One flows, one clings, one makes space, the other consumes it. Eventually, even the ache that once accompanied their memory becomes gentler. You can think of them without your chest tightening. You can remember what was beautiful without needing to recreate it. You no longer need them to be wrong in order for you to be free. You can hold both truths at once. That you cared deeply and that it's better this way, that it mattered and that it's over, that it changed you, and that you no longer need to carry it. This is emotional maturity. Not a lack of feeling, but a broader perspective. You don't need to rewrite the past. You just stop letting it to dictate your present. Letting go also opens up a kind of compassion that was difficult to access before. Not because you forget what happened, not because you excuse it, but because you no longer carry it in your nervous system. And when the sting is gone, your perspective widens. You see the other person more clearly, you see their limitations, their own wounds, the patterns they were stuck in. You don't romanticize them, but you don't demonize them either. You just recognize that they were operating from their own level of awareness, just as you were. And now you're both somewhere else. This clarity doesn't always come with a sense of satisfaction. Sometimes it comes with quiet grief. You see what could have been had you both been different, had timing aligned, had certain conversations been possible, but you don't try to reach for those outcomes anymore. You let them live in the past, where they belong. You stop assigning blame. You stop assigning meaning to every detail. You just let it rest. That's not detachment, that's resolution. The soft, steady release of energy that was never meant to be held so long. And when you start to dream again, not just about love, but about life, it feels different. You're not dreaming from the wound. You're not chasing a version of healing that requires another person to complete it. You're simply exploring, not from emptiness, but from wholeness. You begin to notice what you want now, not as a reaction, but as a new expression. You want peace, honesty, reciprocity, the kind of connection that doesn't require you to translate yourself constantly, the kind that doesn't rely on potential, that doesn't live in projection, that simply meets you where you are. You also stop rushing the process. You don't need the next thing to arrive immediately. You've learned to live with space, to let life unfold, to trust your own timing. You've learned that healing isn't measured by milestones. It's measured by presence, by the way you return to yourself after something pulls you away, by the way you hold yourself when something stirs. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to stay connected. And even when you drift, even when you forget, something in you remembers the way back. That remembering is a kind of wisdom, not the kind you read in a book, but the kind that lives in your bones. It tells you quietly that you've survived things you never thought you would, that you've made it through endings you didn't want, that you've grieved what you thought would break you. And now, here you are, whole. Not because nothing hurt you, but because you didn't let it define you. You let it move through you. And eventually you let it go. And the letting go didn't make you cold. It didn't make you guarded. It made you discerning, soft in the right places, boundaried in the places where you used to collapse. It didn't close your heart. It cleared the way for a different kind of love. one that starts with self-trust, one that doesn't ask you to sacrifice yourself in order to stay close to someone else, one that knows peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of respect, of honesty, of ease. Letting go in the end wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a choice you made one day and never had to revisit. It was a slow untying, a gentle loosening, a series of pauses, a shift in breath. And now, looking back, you see how far you've come. Not in distance from them, but in depth with yourself. You're not proud in a loud way. You're not triumphant. You're just here, present, unburdened, and finally, at peace. From this new place of peace, you begin to notice how little urgency remains in you. You used to chase closure, clarity, certainty. You used to reach toward others for answers, for reassurance, for some kind of proof that what you felt was real or valid or mutual. And now that reaching has quieted, not because you've hardened, not because you no longer care, but because something deeper in you has taken root, a knowing that doesn't need confirmation, a steadiness that doesn't require external validation to hold its shape. It's not indifference, it's self-trust. You move through your days differently. You don't perform your calm. You are calm. You don't explain your distance. You simply maintain it. You don't brace for loss. Every time something new begins, you've stopped assuming that every good thing must come at a cost, that every connection must carry the weight of proving your worth. There's less defense in you, less tension, and more space. The kind of space that allows connection without fear, openness without pressure, love without self-erasure. Sometimes you think about how long you carried things, the invisible weight, the thoughts that looped long after the person had left, the questions that had no answers. You carried them out of habit, out of hope, out of loyalty to the story. But you no longer need to. There's no one left to convince. There's nothing left to fix. You gave your presence. You did your part. And now that chapter has closed. Not just in your mind, but in your nervous system. That's what real release feels like. Not forgetting, not pretending, just no longer carrying. You may still feel waves from time to time. That's normal. That's human. But the waves no longer knock you off balance. They pass. You breathe. You stay grounded. You recognize that grief is not a sign of regression. That missing someone doesn't mean you want them back. That memory can visit without reattaching. You've changed your relationship to the past. It no longer owns your attention. It no longer dictates your choices. It lives in a quieter part of you now, present, acknowledged, but no longer in control. Letting go also changed what you reach for. You no longer crave the loud, the dramatic, the uncertain. You no longer pursue connection that feels like a puzzle to solve. You value peace over intensity, clarity over mystery, mutuality over potential. You want something that feels like exhaling, like coming home to yourself in the presence of someone else. You're no longer seduced by the chase. You don't need to prove you're lovable. You already know. And because of that, your standards are different. Not higher in a rigid way, but more aligned with your truth. And when you meet someone who feels safe, you notice that you show up differently too. You're not rushing to be perfect. You're not shape-shifting to match their preferences. You're not scanning for signs that they'll leave. You're just there, honest, attuned, clear. You say what you mean. You ask for what you need. You listen without fear. You give without losing yourself. This is the quiet power that comes from letting go of the past. You've reclaimed the energy you once spent managing fear, and now it supports presence. There's also a new kind of patience in you. You're no longer pushing for the future to arrive quickly. You're not using people or plans to distract yourself from the discomfort of now. You can sit with what is, even when it's incomplete, even when it's uncertain. You've learned that not everything needs to be resolved in order to be okay. Some questions don't need answers yet, some stories don't need conclusions, and some parts of you are still unfolding. And that's not a problem. That's life. Letting go brought you back to the present. You stopped living in imaginary conversations. You stopped anticipating outcomes. You stopped building your identity around what didn't work. Now your life is filled with what's real, what's here, what's chosen. You move through your world with your eyes open. You speak from the middle of your truth, not the edges of your fear, and you notice how much more energy you have now, that you're not constantly managing what's already gone. And even as you look ahead, your expectations have shifted. You're not looking for someone to save you. You're not waiting to be completed. You're not hoping that love will fix what only you can hold. You've already done the work. You've met yourself in your quietest, hardest moments. And because of that, anything or anyone that arrives now must be able to meet you in that same depth. You won't settle for being half heard. You won't stay where your peace is compromised. Not out of pride, but out of understanding. Because peace isn't negotiable once you've known its taste. There's a certain beauty in knowing you no longer need to explain why you've let something go. You're not seeking validation for your boundaries. You're not trying to prove that it was the right decision. You're not collecting agreement from others in order to feel settled. You've reached the kind of clarity that's quiet, the kind that doesn't need an audience. You trust yourself now, and that trust is more valuable than anyone else's understanding. Not because you're stubborn, but because you've spent enough time with your own experience to know what peace costs and what it's worth. You also begin to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude. What once felt like absence now feels like presence. You are alone at times, but not empty. You are with yourself in ways that feel full, safe, centered. You don't fill the silence with noise anymore. You don't reach for connection just to soften discomfort. You let the discomfort speak. You listen to it, you learn from it, and then you let it pass. You no longer treat your emotions as emergencies. They're just weather. Temporary, meaningful, but not dangerous. You're not afraid of your own inner world anymore. And that's a quiet kind of freedom. Letting go reshapes your sense of time. You don't rush toward the next chapter in order to escape this one. You understand that wholeness isn't waiting for you somewhere out there. It's something you can touch gently, even in the middle of transition. You no longer wait for everything to be resolved before you feel peace. You make peace with what's still shifting, what's still unfinished. You stop treating life like a problem to be solved. You begin to experience it as a process to be present with. You're not trying to speed anything up anymore. You're just walking, one steady step at a time. Sometimes you'll be reminded of how far you've come, not by dramatic moments, but by quiet ones. You'll pass a place that used to trigger you and feel nothing. You'll hear a name that once made your heart race, and your breath will stay even. You'll be confronted with a familiar pattern, and instead of falling into it, you'll pause and choose something different. Those are the real milestones, the ones no one sees, the moments where the past no longer claims you, where presence wins. You may also begin to notice that you give differently now. You're no longer offering your time, your energy, your care, just to prove your value. You're not overextending. You're not saying yes from guilt. You're not managing everyone else's emotions at the expense of your own. You've learned that your worth doesn't live in how much you give away. It lives in how you hold yourself, even when no one is watching. And now, when you give, it's from choice, from clarity, not from fear, not from lack. Letting go has made you softer, not in a way that makes you fragile, but in a way that makes you real. You don't need to armor up anymore. You don't need to hide your tenderness behind cynicism or detachment. You can care deeply without collapsing. You can open without losing yourself. That kind of softness is earned. It comes after heartbreak, after rebuilding, after learning. The boundaries don't close you off. They let the right things in. You no longer confuse walls with safety. You understand the difference now. And because of that, you can be open in a way that's sustainable. You're also less reactive now. You don't respond to everything that pulls at your attention. You don't chase every question your mind offers. You let thoughts rise and fall without grabbing onto them. You don't need to resolve every discomfort immediately. You sit with it. You breathe through it. You trust that insight comes when it's ready. You don't force your way to clarity. You receive it gently when the moment is right. This patience is new. It's hard-earned. It comes from letting go, not just of people, but of the need to control the outcome of every emotional experience. And when joy returns, which it does in small, unannounced ways, you let it in. You don't question it. You don't search for the catch. You let yourself laugh even if there's still sadness underneath. You let yourself enjoy what's here even if it's temporary. You've stopped waiting for a life without loss. You've started living inside a life that holds both grief and joy, memory and presence, endings and beginnings. You don't compartmentalize anymore. You let things coexist. That's what healing has taught you, that you don't need to be entirely finished to feel whole. Eventually, you'll meet others who are walking a similar path, people who are present, who speak from their center, who listen without needing to fix, who hold space without turning it into performance. And when you do, it will feel different. Not because they complete you, but because they don't require you to abandon yourself. You'll feel safe, not in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of mutual respect. That's the kind of connection that grows from the soil of letting go. Something stable, something soft, something true. And by the time you reach that kind of connection, if and when it comes, you won't be arriving from a place of lack. You'll no longer be looking for someone to fix the parts of you that once felt broken. You won't be asking to be rescued from your own loneliness. You won't be hoping that love will rewrite the past. You'll be arriving as a whole person, someone who knows their edges, someone who has made peace with their complexity, someone who isn't perfect but is present. And that presence changes everything. It becomes the ground beneath the relationship, not something to be built by it. Letting go prepares you for this, not just by removing what was never meant to stay, but by strengthening what remains. Your patience, your intuition, your values. The quiet sense that you don't have to hold everything together for love to be real. You don't need to earn affection. You don't need to monitor your every move. You just need to keep showing up as yourself. Calm, consistent, whole, not to impress anyone, not to secure anything, but because being rooted in yourself is no longer negotiable. You might look back at everything you've released, relationships, roles, patterns, expectations, and feel a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Grief for what never became. Gratitude for what no longer weighs you down. That mix is normal. It's honest. It reflects the complexity of healing. Letting go doesn't require you to hate what you once loved. It simply invites you to stop carrying what no longer fits. You can honor the past without staying in it. You can remember without returning. You can love without needing to hold. This inner clarity begins to shape how you spend your time, what you say yes to, what you walk away from. You no longer fill your schedule out of obligation. You're not performing busyness to avoid silence. You choose differently now. You rest without guilt. You set limits without apology. You prioritize what feels aligned, not what looks impressive. And the life that starts to form from that place, it feels quiet, yes, but deeply yours. Not built from pressure, built from presence. You're not chasing, you're cultivating. You may also realize that so much of what you once believed you needed was really a reflection of what you were trying to give yourself. The reassurance, the warmth, the approval. It wasn't about them, not fully. It was about you, trying to find access to a feeling you didn't yet know how to generate from within. And now, with time and space and honesty, you've begun to build that inner resource. You don't need someone to tell you you're enough to believe it. You don't need someone to stay to feel secure. You carry that sense of self with you now, quietly like a steady current. That steadiness allows you to experience connection without fear. You can be close to someone without collapsing into them. You can open without overexposing. You can trust without pretending. The trust means certainty. You're not controlling outcomes anymore. You're observing, participating, communicating. You're rooted, and you let the connection move how it moves. Naturally, honestly, without pressure. If it deepens, you meet it. If it fades, you don't chase. You've stopped turning people into projects. You've stopped trying to rewrite your own story through someone else. And when you're alone, you don't feel lost. You don't feel behind. You're not waiting for the next thing to prove that you're lovable, valuable, chosen. You're not in limbo, you're in motion, even in stillness. You're building a life that feels spacious, a life that reflects your current values, not your former fears. You're choosing with care, saying less, but saying it more clearly, showing up when it matters, stepping back when it doesn't. You're not driven by reaction. You're guided by inner alignment. Letting go gave you back your center. It gave you the space to remember who you are without the noise of someone else's absence. It gave you the time to rebuild trust with yourself. It allowed your nervous system to settle, your thoughts to soften, your emotions to stabilize. You stopped needing closure from someone else. You gave it to yourself. Not all at once, not perfectly, but slowly, gently. And that's what healing actually looks like. Not a single moment of realization, but an accumulation of small choices that slowly reshape the way you live. And now you live differently. You don't rush intimacy. You don't fear distance. You don't make love into a test. You let it unfold or you let it pass. You stop holding on when things start to feel heavy in the wrong way. You no longer confuse struggle with depth. You no longer sacrifice your well-being for the sake of connection. You choose peace. And if love arrives that complements that peace, you welcome it. If not, you stay steady. Letting go didn't make you less capable of connection. It made you more ready for the kind that doesn't cost your sense of self. There's a kind of quiet power in arriving at this place, a state where you no longer carry tension in anticipation of being misunderstood, where you no longer shrink yourself to fit the comfort of someone else, where your peace is not reactive, not temporary, not conditional. It simply exists. And because of that, you don't feel the need to defend it. You don't argue for your worth. You don't chase what walks away. You don't rehearse who you need to become in order to be accepted. You just continue being who you are, gently, clearly, without performance. Letting go doesn't erase the past, but it releases your grip on it. It gives your hands back to you so you can use them to create again, not cling, so you can reach for what aligns now, instead of holding on to what once felt familiar. You stop trying to convince your past to behave differently. You stop asking yesterday to shape your future. You live here in this version of yourself, this wiser, softer, steadier version that no longer believes your peace depends on external resolution. You're no longer searching for the right words from someone else to free you. You've already spoken them quietly inside your own heart. And with this new kind of freedom, you learn to love differently. Love isn't something you give to avoid being abandoned. It's not something you offer as proof of your value. It's something you share from overflow, from clarity, from presence. You don't need someone to complete you. You don't need someone to fill a space that no longer feels empty. You want connection, yes, but not at the cost of your own inner life. And that's how you know you're ready. Not because everything is perfectly healed, but because you've stopped looking for someone else to hold what you've already learned to carry. You'll still feel things deeply, but your emotions won't destabilize you the way they used to. A memory may rise, and you'll let it. A wave of sadness may appear, and you'll sit with it. A spark of longing may flicker, and you won't confuse it for a reason to go back. You let your feelings move without needing to act on them. That's emotional maturity, not detachment, but containment. The ability to hold complexity without collapsing into it. You've developed that now, not by force, but by practice. And every time you do it again, your sense of self grows stronger. You'll also notice how your boundaries feel different, not rigid, not defensive, just real, just present. They're no longer about punishment or protection. They're about clarity. They say, this is where I end and you begin. This is what I have space for. This is what I move toward. They come without explanation now, without apology. You don't need others to agree in order to feel safe. You trust the signals your body gives you. You don't override your intuition for the sake of connection. You know what it costs, and you're no longer willing to pay that price. Letting go taught you to discern what is yours to carry. You stopped absorbing the moods of others. You stopped internalizing the way someone treated you as a reflection of your worth. You stopped confusing chaos with passion. You've come to understand the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between intensity and intimacy. You don't confuse being chosen with being cherished. You don't mistake effort with alignment. These distinctions weren't always clear, but now they are. And with that clarity, you make different choices, quieter, more aligned ones. And so your life feels different now. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle, steady rhythms. You wake up without dread. You go to sleep without circling thoughts. You move through your day without anticipating emotional interruption. There's ease, Not constant happiness, but ease. A lightness you couldn't quite imagine before. The kind that comes from not fighting yourself anymore. From no longer trying to undo what's already done. From accepting that closure is not something someone gives you. It's something you allow yourself when you stop waiting. There may still be moments when something stirs unexpectedly. That's okay. You're not here to avoid feeling. You're here to be free in the presence of feeling, to notice what arises without attaching meaning to every flicker. You don't interpret every emotional shift as a call to action. You let it pass, like weather, like sound. You hold your ground, you breathe, and you return not to the past, not to the story, but to the steady center within yourself. That's where you live now. And in that center, you begin to feel what it's like to live without longing, not without desire, but without lack. You don't need something else to complete this moment. You're not reaching for the next thing to prove you're okay. You're already okay. Right here, in this breath, in this room, in this quiet, settled knowing that you made it through the hardest part. Not because it didn't hurt, but because you stopped resisting the hurt. You let it teach you. You let it move through. And now, it no longer holds you. You're free, fully, finally, freely, free. And now, as the noise fades and the quiet becomes familiar, you begin to sense something new rising in its place. Not a rush, not a need, just a slow awareness that you are no longer standing at the edge of something unfinished. You've stepped past it. Not with fanfare, not with triumph, but with calm. You didn't force the ending. You simply stopped carrying what was no longer yours. And because of that, something else now has room to grow. Something gentle, something grounded, something that doesn't arrive to fix or fill or prove, only to accompany. You no longer measure your healing by how much you remember or how often they cross your mind. You no longer wait for the moment when you feel nothing at all, because you understand now that healing isn't about absence. It's about integration. It's about holding a memory without letting it shape your future. It's about looking back without needing to return. That's the quiet miracle of letting go. Not forgetting, but remembering differently. Without pain, without tension, without the need to make it mean something more than it does. You may never get the words you once waited for. You may never understand why they couldn't meet you where you stood. But you've stopped building your peace around the hope that they will. You've stopped treating their silence as a reason to stay in your head. You've stopped arguing with what is. There's no more defense, no more resistance, just a soft, solid knowing that you can be okay without every question answered, without every ending wrapped in resolution. Peace doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be real. And now that it is, you carry yourself differently. You speak more clearly. You listen more openly. You pause more often, not because you're afraid, but because you're aware. You know what your energy costs. You know how it feels to betray your own sense of truth, and you're no longer willing to pay the price of pretending. Letting go wasn't just about releasing someone else. It was about reclaiming that honest place inside you that always knew. The part of you that didn't need proof, only permission. And now, that part leads. You won't always notice how much you've changed. Growth doesn't arrive with celebration. It arrives in the way you rest, the way you respond, the way you return to yourself in the middle of uncertainty. You stop needing others to soothe you. You start becoming the one who soothes yourself. You offer kindness without expectation. You receive love without fear. You let people come and go without gripping. You allow joy to rise without bracing for the fall. This is what steadiness looks like. Not perfection, not detachment, but presence, held gently over time. And the more you live from this place, the more your life reflects it. You're not constantly recovering anymore. You're not waiting for the next rupture. You're not centering your identity around who hurt you or what left. You're creating something beyond the healing. You're building something new, not from emptiness, but from alignment. And it shows in your relationships, in your work, in your inner world. There's coherence now. A sense that what you say, what you do, and what you feel are no longer at odds. You still carry your history, but it walks beside you now, not in front, not behind. It doesn't interrupt your steps. It doesn't pull at your attention. It just moves with you, quietly, as a witness, as a chapter, not as a weight. That's what freedom feels like. Not the absence of the past, but the absence of its grip. Not pretending it never mattered, but no longer letting it steer the direction of your days. You've taken your story back, and you're writing it now, not from pain, but from presence. Good night. Sleep well.